Hi everyone. In this lesson, we're going to be given a graph and we're going backwards and writing an equation. So instead of graphing it from an equation, we're writing an equation from the graph. So you have to know a lot of the same things that we did in our other notes, but we're looking for them from the graph instead of from the equation. So I wrote out some steps for you. I'm not going to necessarily follow this order, but if you get stuck or are confused, this would be a good starting place for you. Okay, so when we write our equation, we have to know our A, B, C, and D. So our amplitude is A, our period helps us find B, our vertical shift is C, and then the sine and cosine each have their own phase shift or horizontal shift. So what I like to do is I first look for a section of the graph that would be sine. So sine starts in the middle, goes up, down, and back to the middle. So if we look for sine, there's a couple different ways to find it. There's kind of one here, but I'm going to use the one that starts here. So I'm going to use this sine. Okay, so remember, a lot of these pictures are going to have more than one period to it. And you can start and write a bunch of different graphs. Like there's an infinite amount of options for you. So you just have to find one. So this is where I'm going to use for sine. Okay, so if that's our graph, the middle of sine is where our vertical shift is. So that means we're shifted up 1 for our vertical shift. Another word for that line that goes right through the middle is the midline. It's one of your vocab words in your vocab book. Okay, so the midline is like the middle where your vertical shift shifts you to, the center of our graph. So we got shifted up 1 because that's where our center is. So once you find that, you can find your amplitude. There's a formula up top for it, but I just look and see, like from the middle of our graph, how high and low do we get. So we go up 1 and we go down 1, so our amplitude would just be 1. Up here it says that you would do the max point minus the midpoint divided by 2. So that's finding the middle. So 2 minus 0 divided by 2 would give you 1. Okay, so next we'll find our period. And so with the period, you have to be able to figure out like what each box is worth and how big it goes. So we have pi over 2, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks there. So we're splitting pi over 2 into fourths. Or if you look at it all the way to pi, there'd be 8 blocks. So that means that each block is worth an eighth. So if this is 2 eighths, 3, 4, 5, 6 eighths. So we go from 2 pi over 8 to 6 pi over 8. So the distance that's in between there would be 4 pi over 8. Right, if we go from here to here, this is 4 pi over 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that means that our period is pi over 2. So to find your B, we would use our period formula, or, we've had a lot of examples and problems that have had a period of pi over 2. So you might know your B just from knowing that. If you don't, take your equation to find your period, 2 pi over B, and make it equal what you know your period is, pi over 2. So if you cross multiply and solve this equation for B, you would end up that your B is 4. So some of the harder ones you might want to use that formula. So have your formula equal to the period to go backwards to find your B. Okay, so next we need to figure out where our cosine shift is and where our sine shift is. So our sine, we already figured out where sine starts. So it would be 2 pi over 8, which is also known as pi over 4. Our cosine, remember, starts at the top and then goes down. So one of our cosines could be this section. We could have had one right here. Remember, there's an infinite amount of options. It doesn't matter where you start. Technically, we could have done this one and made it negative to flip it over. So I'm going to choose this one. To make some consistency, usually I say the closest one that's positive or negative. So that technically would be that one right there, but I already chose that one, so we'll go with that one. But the closest one to the y-axis is usually what we write, so that way we're not like branching way far out. So we get our cosine value of 3 pi over 8. Okay, so now we're plugging in. Remember, our general formula is y equals c plus a sine or cosine b x minus d. So if we plug everything into our equation, we would have y equals 1 plus 1 sine, our b value is 4, and we have a phase shift, so x plus minus pi over 4. Remember, it's always opposite of the sign, so if our shift is positive, our equation will be negative. You could put the 1 for the amplitude, but I left it out because it's just 1. You know, you times by 1, it's the same. So now we'll do the same thing for cosine. Everything's the same except the shift. So cosine had its own phase shift. And then we got it, and that's it. So that's how we write equations from graphs. So let's take a look. They can get more complicated, as you see, because they might not always give you a whole section of the graph. Okay, so let's start with, actually I think we're going to start with this bottom one, because it's kind of tricky, but not as hard as some of the other ones. Okay, so first things first, we have to figure out how much of the graph we're shown, and then go from there. So I know this would be cosine starting up there, and then we would get here would be how much of our graph. Good, that's half of our graph. Okay, so that means if we finished half of our graph in pi over 2, then to get back up here, we would end at pi. So our period is pi. So we can do the formula 2 pi over b equals pi and solve the equation to get our b, which is going to be 2. Okay, so we need to figure out where the middle is. So we go from 3 to -1. Our graph is 4 tall, so the middle would be 2 from the top right here at 1. So there's our middle. So that's our vertical shift. That shows us our amplitude right there, the highest to the middle. Or if you use the formula in the front, 3 minus -1 over 2. Highest minus the lowest divided by 2. Either way, we get that the amplitude is 2. So now we have to find our cosine and sine phase shift. So cosine is easy because cosine starts at the middle or the top and then goes down. So cosine hasn't shifted at all. There's no shift for cosine. Sine is a little bit trickier, especially since they cut off our graph and we can't see everything over there. I mean, we can extrapolate where it's going to end right there by how many boxes over it is. But I kind of want to just do this one because, well, I guess it's going to be the same. So right here, we would be at pi over 4. So that means that right here, to get that sine, the normal sine, it would be at -pi over 4. If we count our boxes, there's 4. So each one's worth 1/8 again. So if we have 2, it'd be 1/4. So we'll do this one for a sine. But we could have done this one and then just made it negative. Okay, so I'm going to do cosine is -pi over 4. Okay, so remember y equals c plus a sine b parentheses x minus d. So c plus a sine b x minus, so minus a negative is going to make it plus. So mostly the same for cosine, except since our shift is 0, I'm just going to not put the parentheses. Okay, so let's try another one that's a little tricky, and then you guys can practice the other ones on your own. So this first one I think is the hardest because it's hard to tell how much of your graph you were given. So if we go from here to here. And it might be, this one, like I said, is really hard. It might be hard for you to see that that would be a fourth of the graph. Okay, if you extended it, you'd have to go here and you would have half, and then it would need the bottom and back up. So from here to here, fourth, half, and then the other half. So for this one, only a fourth of the graph is shown. Okay, and that's important to know because you can see how big that is, and then if this is a fourth of the graph, we would times by 4 to get the whole graph and find our period. So what we have here is 2 pi. So 2 pi times 4 means that our period for this one would be 8 pi. So remember, to find b, we do 2 pi over b equals 8 pi. So if we cross multiply, we end up with that b is a fourth. So if this is the center of our graph, how do I know it's the center? Good, remember we talked about it. We'll go up and then back up. Okay, so this is the center since we have to mirror it down at the bottom. We know our vertical shift is -1. From here to the highest point is our amplitude, so we would go up 4 to get to the highest point. Since we're starting in the middle and going up, there's no shift for sine. And then this peak right here is where our cosine starts. So our shift for cosine is 2 pi. So if we plug everything in, we'd have -1 plus 4 sine 1/4 x, -1 plus 4 cosine 1/4 x minus 2 pi. Okay, so go ahead and try the other ones. It really helps to find some kind of starting point. I was going to say I really like to do cosine better, but it really depends on what part of the graph you're given. If you're going to try to start with, see what you have based on sine or cosine for the period, just look what you're given. If you're only shown a peak like what we were shown here, then kind of figure it out based on cosine. But for this one, we were shown the middle, so I used sine. Okay, so go ahead and pause and try those other 4 examples, and when you come back, I'll help you figure out how to get them. Okay, so for this one, we had half of our graph, and I knew that because we had a peak here and then the valley, so that means we would need to go back up to get our other peak. So it's half of the graph. So if half of our graph is completed in 3 pi, then our whole period is 2 pi. So for this one, what we did, we had no vertical shift because half of it is on either side. Then we went up 2. I put sine was starting right here at 3 pi over 2, and then I put cosine was starting right here at 3 pi. We could have done it here and just made an amplitude negative, which is what I did for one of the other ones, I think. So for this one over here, we were shown half of the graph again, and I know that because it was just the whole valley, so we would need the peak part too. Oh, this is the one that I made the amplitude be negative. So if I'm saying that sine has no shift, sine would normally go up, but since we went down, that's where I made it negative because it flipped. The same thing with cosine. If I'm starting here at pi, cosine would normally go down and then up, but I went up and then back down, so we had to flip it. Okay, so in the bottom, these 2 I think that are left are more straightforward. There wasn't much different about them. So if you have any questions on those, make sure you write them down or star them or circle them or something, and that way you can ask me about it in class and we'll go over anything you guys didn't understand.